Hey everypony. So after I got done with work, I was kind of in a steam mood last night, so I came home and just vented and did whatever. And distracted myself, and eventually I was in a pretty cheerful mood. Anyway, so I was browsing YouTube, and I was watching a video by Magic Turtle 643, link right here. So in the video, he ends up talking about being yourself. So I'm going to try to convey the message that I heard in the words that I'm going to try not to paraphrase too much. No matter what you're doing at any given point, you are being you. Then he went on to make other demonstrations and stuff like that. And it really got me kind of thinking. So if in any state, you're you. And you could probably exist in like a lot of different states if you really think about it. Like your personal state, like your emotional being, where you are physically, but also emotionally and mentally, etc., etc. And because I like to watch SciShow and other informative and educational things about science and stuff like that, and I do find quantum mechanics kind of interesting, though I don't have an in-depth enough knowledge of them to really talk to anybody about them in a way that would really educate them about them. So I was thinking about some of the laws or stuff about quantum mechanics, and how there's some sort of thing about how it's really difficult to know the exact location and position of quantum particles. Sometimes they act like particles, sometimes they act like waves, sometimes it's easier to think of them in concepts like fields. And I think that's also kind of interesting because humans seem to act on in different levels. Like we kind of behave on societal levels and group levels, but we also behave on individual levels. So sometimes we act like particles and sometimes we act like waves. You know, in quantum mechanics you can't really observe them because observing them changes the state, because the act of observing is in some ways an interaction. In a lot of ways, in fact pretty much always is an interaction. And when you try to observe yourself, you enter a sort of introspective state. And if you're asking a person questions and observing it, or if you're watching them, it tends to make them feel slightly different if they're feeling you watched. The only way to really observe a person without disrupting their state is to do it completely without them knowing. So I guess that comparison falls a little bit. So it just really got me thinking, maybe human consciousness is a little bit something like quantum mechanics. I just think maybe it's an interesting way to look at the relationship. Especially because when you really look at physics and calculus and stuff like that, it's really, all these formulas and expressions and equations are really about expressing relationships between things, and it makes it kind of a really interesting language into and of itself. So then I just want to talk very briefly about personal emotional state. A baseline reference for state is on and off, as seen in like transistors and stuff like that. And I think something that's interesting about human consciousness is you could probably exist in quite a few different states. Like there's just so many different combinations. So something would probably be trying to come up with some sort of mapping system, just like saying like we have to be able to draw diagrams or be able to visibly show, you know, how electrons orbit and stuff like that to really give that idea. So it started out with, you know, orbits that looked like how our planets orbit the sun, but now we understand that it's a little bit more complex. And of course, that's a study into and of itself, is figuring out how the brain actually reaches its conclusions and perspectives and where emotion comes from and all of that. So, you know, so I guess we kind of need like a map of consciousness. No, not like that. When I think about it, I guess the images that sort of pop up in my head maybe resemble something a little bit more like this. I really should have planned this better. So down here, we have a sort of baseline going on, sort of saying like this is like zero emotional state, if you will. So then up here we have the actual state. So this is kind of an interesting way that my brain sort of looks at it. Oftentimes up here we have like the emotions that you were expressing and the various degrees that you were expressing them in. So you might have like happy, angry, and sad, and joy, fear, etc. Because etc. is a feeling too. Things, we have lots of experiences and ways that we perceive certain things, and people even have different feelings about feelings. So when you start observing how certain feelings interact with each other, or even ones that almost seem conflicting, like when we have bittersweet moments, and we're like, oh man, like, it's so touching. Why did Leonardo DiCaprio have to die so Kate Winslet could live? Not that I really was a huge fan of the movie anyways. So your experiences kind of fill this whole mess, and they shape the way that we feel about things. So if we consider our baseline to be sort of like neutral, like not feeling anything about anything, interpreting these allows us to see, and then examining this, I guess, too, allows us to see how we get from nothing to why things make us feel into these states and everything like that. Well, obviously, this map isn't even a very good one. I can't even think about a good way to perceive it because it's almost just too broad for me to put, especially on like a dry erase board. But the thought here is that when you look at all of these things, they're sort of like a bunch of switches on tracks, if you will, or connections being made, or like synapses. And when you start talking about it in those terms, you can think of them a lot more in the sense of like synapses, switches, which are on and off, which is why I guess I tend to think of emotional state as a whole bunch of on and off switches where your brain is like at any given moment, these synapses are firing and these ones aren't, these ones are on and these ones aren't, and so it generates your current emotional state and everything like that. My thoughts on a memory is that it's sort of like that moment or those moments and the similar things that maintain the same in your position in which things were on and which things off. So memories are almost like saved states. Anyways, these have just been some of my thoughts for the day. Trot on, every pony. Also, alter ego, minding my T's and Q's.